And if Venezuela attacks American ships on the Caribbean coast, what can happen? At 3:47 a.m. local time, sirens cut silence at the Southern Command of the United States in Miami. On the illuminated operating room screens, red dots flashes incessantly over the Caribbean digital map. The unthinkable has just happened. 3 American freighter ships were attacked simultaneously in international waters, only 80 nautical miles from the Venezuelan coast. The first satellite images show orange flames by cutting the oceano darkness, while intelligence officers confirm what no one wanted to hear. The anti-lock missiles were fired from Venezuelan territory. This is not just another diplomatic incident. This is the moment when decades of tension between Washington and Caracas explode in a crisis that can completely redefine the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. But how did we get here? And most importantly, what happens now? To understand the magnitude of this moment, we need to go back in time and dive into the turbulent waters of history between these two nations. The relationship between the United States and Venezuela has always been complex, marked by periods of cooperation followed by deep crises. For decades, Venezuela has been one of the leading oil suppliers for the United States, a partnership that seemed unwavering. But everything changed with the rise of Hugo Chavez to power in 1999. Chavez not only challenged American hegemony in the region, but built a narrative of resistance that resonated deeply in Latin America. He nationalized the oil industry, expelled American companies, and more provocatively, began to approach historical opponents of the United States, Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. Every movement of Chavez was calculated to irritate Washington, from the purchase of Russian Su-30 to the military agreements with Moscow. With the death of Chavez in 2013, many expected a moderation under Nicolás Maduro, but what happened was the opposite. The devastating economic crisis, the hyperinflation that reached over 1 million%, and the exodus of over 7 million Venezuelans created a collapse, but paradoxically more dangerous state. Maduro, desperate to maintain power, intensified anti-American rhetoric, and deepened military ties with Russia and China. Now visualize the White House Situation Room. The president is agreed at 4:15. Its closest advisors gather around the oval mahogany table, its faces illuminated by the bluish shine of the tablets, showing real-time intelligence reports. The Secretary of Defense points to the holographic map designed in the center of the room. Mr. President, we confirmed 3 coordinated attacks. MV Liberty Express, Atlantic Star Freighter, and oil tanker Gulf Pioneer were hit by Chinese C-802 missiles, fired from Venezuelan mobile batteries positioned on the Paraguana Peninsula. The tension in the room is palpable. Each person present understands that the next decision can determine whether we are moving towards a regional war or if there is still room for diplomatic containment. But the options are limited, and all carry huge risks. From a military point of view, Venezuela should not be underestimated. Although his armed forces suffered with years of economic crisis, Caracas still maintains a considerable arsenal. In addition to the Chinese anti-DECOS missiles, Venezuela has Russian air defense systems S-300, Su-30 Mk2 fighters, and even more worrying, possible access to medium-range ballistic missiles provided by Iran. Its naval forces, although reduced, include Kilo Russian-class submarines and rapid speedboats armed with missiles, capable of raw guerrilla operations. But Venezuela's true strength is not just in its military hardware. It is in its ability to transform any conflict into a prolonged asymmetrical war. The country has one of the largest oil reserves in the world, controls strategic points in the Caribbean, and most importantly, has the tacit support of powers that would love to see the United States jammed in another regional conflict. Meanwhile, in the Pentagon corridors, generals analyze detailed Caribbean maps. The American military response would be overwhelming but complicated. The Fourth Fleet of the American Navy, based on Mayport, Florida, could be in attack in less than 18 hours. Nuclear aircraft carrier, destroyers Aegis, attack submarines and B-52 bombers based on the Caribbean air bases would create absolute military superiority. But here is the problem. A total military response would be diplomatically catastrophic. Entire Latin America would be watching. Countries such as Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, already skeptical in relation to American foreign policy, would see any action as excessive imperialism. China and Russia would explore every image of destruction to demonstrate American aggressiveness on the world scene. In the first 6 hours after the attack, the economic consequences are already beginning to materialize. Petroleum prices shoot 40% at the opening of Asian markets. The price of gold reaches historical records while investors look for safe assets. Value bags plumbers globally, with estimated initial losses of more than $2 trillion. But this is just the beginning. Orinoco Strait, where a significant portion of exported Venezuelan oil passes, becomes a war zone. Maritime insurance companies immediately cancel all coverage for ships that move around the region. Maritime transport in the Caribbean, one of the busiest commercial routes in the world, collapses. Products ranging from food to electronics suffer interruptions in supply chains, but the humanitarian consequences are even more devastating. Venezuela, already facing the worst humanitarian crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere, sees its situation exponentially. Hospitals that already worked precariously are completely without energy due to infrastructure bombings. The electric water distribution system, dependent on electricity, enters a total collapse. Neighboring countries, especially Colombia and Brazil, who already house millions of Venezuelan refugees, see their borders be crossed by massive waves of new displaced people. Improvised refugee camps appear overnight. International humanitarian organizations make appeals desperate for resources that simply do not exist in enough. In the Venezuelan capital, Caracas, the civilian population lives the terror of night bombing. Whole families are sheltered in abandoned subway stations, while the sound of American fighters cutting the night sky becomes the soundtrack of fear. Children who have never known war now draw military aircraft on their dust-stained school notebooks. Geopolitically, this conflict redefines global alliances irreversibly. Russia, which has invested billions in Venezuela for years, cannot simply watch its strategic investment destroyed. Moscow announces the sending of military counselors and more sophisticated defense equipment. Putin, at a globally televised press conference, states that American aggression against a sovereign nation cannot be tolerated. China, in turn, has more than $60 billion borrowed from Venezuela. Beijing cannot allow this investment to become a total damage. Chinese ships, supposedly in routine exercises, begin to appear in Caribbean waters for the first time in modern history. The most worrying is Iran's reaction. Tehran sees in the Venezuelan crisis a unique opportunity to press the United States on multiple fronts simultaneously. Iranian vessels, loaded with weapons and volunteers, begin to appear in Venezuelan ports that still remain functional. At the United Nations General Assembly, an emergency session is called. The Venezuelan ambassador, with his voice embargoed by emotion, shows devastating images of American civil attacks. This is genocide disguised as a military operation, he says, while diplomats of dozens of countries wave agreeing. The U.S. ambassador responds that Venezuelan attacks on merchant ships constitute acts of international piracy, but his words sound hollow in the face of images of destruction that dominate world television screens. Brazil closes its borders with Venezuela, fearing that the conflict will spread. Colombia declares neutrality, but secretly allows American bases on its territory to be used for intelligence operations. Mexico calls an OAS emergency meeting, asking for immediate ceasefire, but his words are lost in the noise of war. 3 weeks after the conflict began, the numbers are terrifying. More than 50,000 Venezuelan civilians died, most of them due to lack of medicines and drinking water. The country's electric infrastructure was destroyed by 80%. The international banking system collapsed completely, taking the Venezuelan economy back to the exchange system. But Venezuela is not fighting alone. Guerrilla cells armed with Russian equipment operate across the country. Portable anti-aircraft missiles overthrow American aircraft weekly. Each captured pilot becomes a powerful part of propaganda in the hands of the Maduro regime. The most disturbing thing is that the war is not confined to the Venezuelan borders. Coordinated cyber attacks, allegedly originating from Venezuela but with Russian and Chinese technical signatures, paralyze American critical infrastructures. Electrical plants in Texas are offline. The American military GPS system undergoes mysterious interference. Wall Street is forced to stop operations for 3 consecutive days due to cyber attacks of unknown origin. 6 months later, the consequences extend far beyond the Caribbean. The Venezuelan refugee crisis becomes the largest in history in the Americas. More than 3 million people crossed borders in search of security. Brazil and Colombia, unable to deal with influx, begin to close their borders violently, creating humanitarian crises in the border zones. Global energy prices remain at historically high levels. The world recession that began with the Venezuelan conflict now affects all the main economies. European governments, already dealing with their own energy crises due to the Ukrainian conflict, see their budgets consumed by military spending and humanitarian assistance programs. Latin America is irrevocably divided. Countries aligned with the United States, such as Chile and Uruguay, face massive demonstrations against the imperialist war. Left governments gain elections in countries that were once reliable American allies. Chinese influence in the region grows exponentially, filling the vacuum left by the deterioration of relations with Washington. But perhaps the most terrible aspect of this hypothetical scenario is how it demonstrates how fast decades of diplomacy can be destroyed for a few hours of violence. International relationships that took generations to build disappear overnight. Alliances that seemed solid are fragile when tested by real conflict. The Venezuelan conflict becomes a global symbol of how 21st century geopolitical rivalries are fundamentally different from those of the past. There are no more clear front lines, no more formal war statements. There is no clear distinction between combatants and civilians. Instead, there is hybrid war, where cyber attacks, information operations, economic war, and physical violence mingle in a mist of conflict that is impossible to resolve with traditional diplomatic tools. As we observe this scenario unfolds, a question remains. How could such a catastrophic situation have been avoided? The answer lies in the nature of modern diplomacy itself. In a world where authoritarian leaders can gain domestic popularity through international confrontations, where social media amplifies tensions instantly, and where global alliances make local conflicts into world crises, the margin for diplomatic errors becomes dangerously small. Venezuela's hypothetical attack on American ships would not only be about oil or maritime territories. It would be about national pride, political survival, and the refusal of leaders to retreat when retreating would mean admitting weakness in the face of their domestic populations. It would be about how small incidents can become historical tragedies when diplomacy fails and when leaders choose war rather than commitment. This scenario reminds us that in our era of increasingly destructive weapons and increasingly complex alliances, peace is not natural. Peace requires constant work, dialogue even with opponents, and leaders willing to choose diplomatic solutions even when military solutions seem simpler. Because in the end, when the last bombs stop falling and when the last refugees find shelter, when the markets stabilize and when the dead are buried, someone will still have to sit on a table and negotiate. The only question is how many lives have been lost and how much destruction has occurred before leaders realize that dialogue was always the only real solution. And so, this hypothetical scenario serves not as a forecast, but as a warning. A reminder that in the interconnected world of the 21st century, regional conflicts quickly become global crises, and that the price of failed diplomacy is always paid by those who can least allow themselves to pay them. Innocent civilians who just want to live their lives in peace.